So welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Love BPD and Communication with Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick. I'm Trisha and I'll be moderating today's event, and we'll be monitoring the chat and Q&A box. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. So the event will be recorded and available on our website. You will not appear in the video and your audio will be muted during the event. You can communicate with our presenter through the chat and Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and closed caption is also available. If you have any questions, you can always email us at programs@abmf.charity, and we'll ensure to get those questions back to you. And we'll be sending a link of the recording as soon as it's available to you after the webinar, and you can also find it on our YouTube channel. So go over through the agenda and the presentation with Dr. Skye, and then we'll follow by a Q&A session. So Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick is with us today, and she's the director of the Tulip Lab. And she is, current research interest focuses on an examination of emotional and relationship processes in the treatment of BPD and PTSD, and identify ways to streamline and refine concurrent treatments for this comorbidity. Dr. Skye, we're honored to have you here today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Great. It looks like we have a small group today, so I think that means we can probably just answer questions as I go and stuff like that. I'll do some Q&A towards the end, but you can type it into the chat at any point. So thank you so much to those of you who have arrived. It means a lot to be here. I love working with organizations like the Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation to share some of the information that we've been working on in my research lab, and thinking about a lot to folks whose lives are impacted by this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because there's so much I want to say. And I'm going to try and keep myself to my time commitment. Okay. So I don't want to talk about me very much. I think that was a really lovely introduction, and thank you for that. But I'll just say briefly a little bit about what we do in my lab. Is that really what my research lab is really focused on, is helping people build lives that feel to them like they are worth living. And we specifically are focused on helping folks who struggle with BPD, but also with PTSD and the intersection of the two and all of the complexity that can come with that for people who are living with it. And we're also really interested in their loved ones as well, and helping their loved ones to thrive and feel good as well, and have all those folks thrive together. So we've been doing a lot of work, not just with people with BPD, but also with their partners, their family members, their friends. So I'm going to start by talking about BPD in, well, I don't know, 30 seconds, but quickly. I don't want to spend the whole time on just describing what BPD is, but I do want to make sure that we're on the same page before I really get into the rest of the content. So a lot of you, probably everyone here knows a little bit at least about BPD. All I'll say at this point is that there's really 5 groups of BPD symptoms. And we often use the word dysregulation when we're talking about BPD to talk about the idea that there's dysregulation in these 5 different domains. So, whoops. People with BPD often experience difficulties in relationships, having more volatile relationships than other people do, more conflict, being more afraid of people rejecting them or leaving them than some other people feel. They experience dysregulation in their emotions. So their emotions might kind of go up and down more than other people do, have more intense emotions than other people. They might struggle more with anger. The behavioral dysregulation piece that I have down there has more to do with like impulsive and potentially self-destructive behaviors that are very common for folks with BPD. So those might be self-injury, suicide attempts, but could also involve substance use, impulsive shopping, binge eating. And then folks with BPD also struggle with their identity. So they might have a difficult time having a clear sense of who they are. They might feel chronically empty inside. They might not really know what they want out of life or feel like it changes quite a bit. And they also might experience something called dissociation, which is on the cognitive circle. And that is kind of a complex experience if you have not experienced it, but people who have kind of recognize it right away, where essentially they kind of have a shift in a sense of consciousness where things may not feel as real as they did before. They might not feel like they're in their bodies. When they're very upset or stressed out, people sometimes slip into this sort of other state. And that can happen a lot for some people with BPD. So the leading kind of most prominent theory of BPD that's out there right now is from Marshall Linehan, who developed the frontline treatment for BPD, which is called dialectical behavior therapy. Marshall Linehan's my academic grandmother. I have nothing but respect, admiration, and reverence for the work that she has done. I mean, really all the research that I've done has been really in the tradition of her work. And what Marcia said in the early 90s is that what is going on for people with BPD is a problem of what we call emotion dysregulation. And she essentially said all BPD symptoms are either directly accounted for by emotion dysregulation or they're direct consequences of it. And there's lots of different ways emotion dysregulation is defined in the literature, but what she basically means is that people with BPD have a biological vulnerability to sensitive, intense, prolonged emotions. So they are kind of, we call them often emotional burn victims, like things that maybe don't hurt so much to somebody else can be very painful for somebody who has this vulnerability to intense emotions that some people with BPD have. And they also have difficulties regulating those emotions. So according to Marshall Linehan, that's the core of BPD. So she essentially went back to those 5 domains of dysregulation that make up the BPD symptoms that I showed you a couple slides back. And she put the emotions in the middle and said, emotion dysregulation is actually the center of the disorder and it drives all the other problems. So if your emotions are going up and down and are changing a lot, then your relationships are going to feel more volatile. You're going to get into more conflict. The way you perceive people is going to change more because your emotions are kind of so what we call labile. They're so intense. It makes it hard for relationships to feel stable. And we know that when people slip into dissociation is when they are feeling highly distressed. And that what dissociation does for people who do it is it kind of dampens emotion in the brain. So it's a way that a lot of people's bodies learn to cope with really intense emotion and kind of shut it down. Similarly, our emotions tell us a lot about who we are. They tell us what we like, what we want to go towards, what we want to go away from, what makes us feel good, what makes us feel bad. We learn a lot about ourselves from that. And when your emotions are going up and down, changing unpredictably, changing in intense ways, it can be really hard to form a clear sense of self. And then lastly, a lot of the more destructive behavior that we see in BPD, like self-injury or binge eating, for a lot of folks serves what we call an emotion regulation function, as in people do it because it helps them to cope with painful emotions. And we know that because research shows us that a lot of people who do these things, they don't do it for no reason. They do it because they're trying to cope with these painful emotions and it can help them control those things. It often backfires in the end, and in the long term might make the emotions more intense over time. But in the short term, not everybody, but a lot of people do this to try and get these intense emotions down. So that is essentially the theory, this biosocial model of BPD. It says kind of emotions are the core of BPD. Everything else comes out from the center of that wheel. And there's a lot of reasons that that makes sense. First of all, we know from many studies that people with BPD do experience elevated negative emotion. Like at baseline, they just have more intense emotion. And we also know that, like I said earlier, that a lot of the harmful behaviors, the destructive behaviors that we see in BPD, like self-injury, do have this emotion regulation function. They do work to change emotion in some way. And then the other reason that it makes sense is that our frontline BPD treatments, namely dialectical behavior therapy, target emotion. They teach people how to work with emotions in a different way, and they work. And not only do they work, but research tells us that improving that way people relate to and can change emotions is a part of why they work. So there's a lot about this kind of emotional model that makes a lot of sense. But where my lab has been going and my research has been going is recognizing that thinking about BPD only as an emotional disorder, as in the core is emotion and that's it, may not make perfect sense. And the reason for this is because myself and my colleagues and many other colleagues that I know have spent many years researching these different aspects of emotion dysregulation in BPD to try and figure out which parts of the emotion processes do people with BPD struggle with. And a lot of the research suggests that they don't struggle with a lot of them. You know, they have this elevated negative emotion at baseline, but there's a lot of emotional components, the different ways people experience emotions that look pretty normal for people with BPD that seem to operate in very similar ways. And it turns out, in at least the experimental research, that people with BPD can regulate or change their emotions as well as other people. So if I teach somebody with BPD a strategy to change their emotions, like let's say mindfulness, they can use that strategy to change their emotions as well as somebody without BPD. So that kind of messes with this theory that BPD is all about problems with emotion. And what the research shows us is that where we see more distinct emotion processes in BPD, like people with BPD having bigger emotional reactions than other people, or more intense reactions or longer lasting reactions, we tend to see those things when the thing that we use to elicit the emotion is interpersonal in nature, as in people with BPD seem to show some emotion dysregulation, specifically in response to relationship-based stress. So a math task, you know, getting someone to do a frustrating math task may not elicit any differences for somebody with BPD or somebody else in what's going on with their emotions, but feeling rejected might. So that got myself and my colleagues really thinking about, well, maybe it's not just about emotions. I mean, certainly it is at least partially about emotions, but maybe there's something else going on there too. And what's going on with people with BPD's relationships, since there's some sore spot around relationships that seems to be really important here. And we know that there are a few different key relationship issues that people with BPD face, that often they struggle with more arguments and conflict in their relationship, more breakups, sometimes more violence in their relationships. And one pattern I wanted to highlight particularly today, because we're talking about communication, is that folks with BPD and their loved ones often have more of this pattern called a pursuer-distancer pattern. It's often called many different things. Sometimes it's been called a demand-withdraw pattern, but often more recently, people have been calling it something called pursuer-distancer. And that's a specific way of communicating. And it's the most common communication pattern in couples that are distressed. And what that pattern involves is when two people are having conflict or having a difficulty in their relationship, one person tends to get more active and maybe kind of pursue the other person, like, you know, criticize or complain or highlight what's going on or get more emotional or more angry. And the other person tends to distance or shut down or avoid. So you can have a couple where two people kind of distance or avoid. So nobody talks about anything that's bad in their relationship. Everybody kind of shuts down and avoids, and they kind of just don't engage with each other when things get rough. You can have a couple where there's two pursuers, where both people kind of attack and kind of argue with each other and criticize each other. This pattern is kind of one of each. So one person might get more upset and kind of criticize or approach the other person, highlight issues, and the other person sort of withdraws, shuts down, says less and less, offers less and less of how they're feeling. And the irony is these two ways of interacting kind of keep each other going. The more one person pulls away, the more the other person moves towards them and gets more upset, more agitated, criticizes more, has more conflict, gets more angry. The more the other person gets more withdrawn and shut down and pulls away. And so we end up in this pattern where a couple's kind of like chasing each other around, but they're not connecting. And that particular pattern is more common in relationships where one person has BPD. It's a very solvable pattern, but it is common. It's a pattern we see often in couple therapies. We also know that relationships seem to be very important to BPD symptoms. So the majority of lethal suicide attempts or harmful suicide attempts in people with BPD are prompted by relationship stressors, which also predict self-injury. And whether or not BPD recovers over time is predicted by the strength of people's intimate relationships. So when people are in strong relationships, it helps them recover. And when they're not, it makes it harder for them to recover. It doesn't mean they can't recover or won't recover, but it makes it a little bit harder. And the good news is we can not only improve and treat BPD, but we can also help improve and treat people with BPD's relationships. So you could think about what the biosocial model did in this kind of different way. You could take emotions out of the ring there and put relationships right into the middle instead and say, no, relationships are the center of BPD, not emotions, and you can make a compelling story that way too. So we know, for example, our relationships are a huge predictor of how we're doing emotionally. I think about times in my life where I've been in relationships that are not doing well. I am much more emotionally distressed and dysregulated than I am when I'm in solid relationships that are functioning well. It's just a huge impact on how we all feel. One of the pieces of cognitive dysregulation in BPD is called paranoid ideation. And this is something that happens for just some people in BPD. When they get really upset or emotional, they start to think about people in more paranoid ways, which is informed by what's going on in their relationships. And just like we learn who we are through our emotions, we also learn who we are through our relationships, who we're around, who we're close to, who we're not close to. That tells us a lot about who we are. And when our relationships are distressed or they're changing a lot, or there's more conflict in them, or our feelings in them are changing a lot, it's hard to form a clear sense of self. And then lastly, with the destructive behavior piece, we do know that those destructive behaviors can serve emotional regulation functions, like I've said earlier, but they can also serve relationship functions too. They can communicate things, they can influence people. And I really want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that anybody with BPD is manipulative or attention seeking or doing something to manipulate somebody else. I really don't think that, and there's no evidence to support that. But we all learn to do things based on how people respond to us, whether we know it consciously or not. So for some folks who are getting needs met in their relationships after really harmful things are happening, like self-injury, it's possible that some part of them is learning that that's a way to get a need met. Not always, but it's possible. So the summary here is that, our relationships make us hurt, but they can help us heal too. They're like these super powerful things in our lives. And this might be especially true for people with BPD. But the other thing that's really important to remember is that a relationship involves at least two people. There's not one person can't completely form the dynamic of a relationship. It takes two to tango, as they say. And so one of the things that my colleagues and I started to look into are what are the ways that people with BPD and their loved ones might be interacting with each other that might be really helpful or might be not so helpful in keeping BPD alive. And so we developed a model called the BIAS model, which stands for the Borderline Interpersonal Affective Systems model. And it's a model that is looking at those two pieces for people with BPD, the way that people with BPD think, feel, and act, and the way their loved ones think, feel, and act, and how they interact with each other, and how those things might be kind of the center of BPD and keep BPD going. So I'm going to show you what that model looks like now, and then we're going to talk a little more about communication. Let me just see if there's anything I should be saying. Okay, great. Okay, so I was just checking the chat. Okay, so the model. So the first thing that we think about is the person with BPD, and everything that we put together in this model is based on research and the science that is out there on what's going on in BPD at this point. So the first thing that we thought was that there's a lot of research that suggests that people with BPD have challenging histories in their relationships. Either early histories where they might have experienced trauma or abuse, or some form of emotional invalidation, like learning that their emotions aren't valid, or they may have experienced conflict in relationships later in life. but we think most people with BPD have experienced something in relationships that's challenging for them that contributes to the development of what we call an interpersonal threat sensitivity. So what does that mean? What I mean by that is what research tells us is that people with BPD are really sensitive for signs that other people are going to hurt them. And they tend to, there's a couple different ways that we've seen that in the research. People with BPD often tend to pay attention to signs people might hurt them more than other people. So if there's a room, if I was giving a speech to a room full of 100 people and 99 are smiling, but one person's frowning or looking angry, if I had BPD, I might be particularly good at picking up that face, paying attention to it. Signs that somebody might be hurtful or might be unloving, might be unkind, might be judging them or something like that. And they're also more likely to interpret relationship information as threatening in that way, even if it's not intended to be. So people with BPD might be more likely to interpret something someone does as indicating that someone is harmful, is not likely to be kind to them, or maybe is going to reject them or is thinking negative things about them. They have a little bit of a bias in that way. So those things make up this interpersonal threat sensitivity, which predicts this factor called emotional reactivity. So, and what I basically mean by that is intense emotional reactions. So because of this sensitivity, when people with BPD see something that indicates a potential threat or harm coming from someone else, whether physical or emotional, or rejection, they are kind of allergic to it. Like they have a stronger emotional reaction than somebody else might. That's the thing where the emotion dysregulation really shows up. And that fear of threat in relationships also makes it harder to communicate to other people. So that might be where somebody with BPD might start to slip into a pursuer distancer pattern, for example, might start to critique or attack, or might start to withdraw or shut down or avoid difficult conversations because they're operating as if a relationship is more threatening than it might be in the reality. Now, I want to be clear that a lot of people with BPD have had very threatening, actually threatening relationships in their past where they've experienced some form of trauma or invalidation. I'm really talking about the context of a current relationship that is maybe not harmful in that way, but sometimes can feel threatening because of that learning history. So those two things kind of ping off each other. When people's emotions go up, they have a hard time communicating more effectively. And when they have a hard time communicating more effectively, their emotions go up further. And we know that when our emotions are more intense, that is often when we engage in that destructive behavior. So self-injury is a good example, but again, you could say binge eating or shopping impulsively or substance use. And for some people, that behavior in the short term does decrease negative emotion. It comes at a cost because it tends to make negative emotion worse in the long term. A lot of people don't realize that. But it does in the short term for some folks drop emotion down. So after all this emotional reactivity, that's when a lot of people will choose to self-injure, for example. So we think that that's the main core of what's going on in BPD and that this process drives a lot of the other BPD symptoms. But like I said, there are more than one person in a relationship. It takes at least two people to make a relationship. And so we also wanted to figure out, well, what is going on in the loved ones of people with BPD and their significant others and their partners, their friends, their family members, that might be interacting with this cycle, right? All of this is happening in the context of a relationship, not in a vacuum. And we know that, everybody has their own learning history. So a lot of significant others of people with BPD, partners, for example, might have their own history of what relationships look like, what kind of emotions are acceptable, how they can express emotion, whether it's safe to share emotion, whether it's not safe to share emotion. They also might have a learning history of the person with BPD. Maybe they've had an experience where they've had conflict and it's led to a really scary moment, like a really intense expression of anger or self-injury for the person with BPD. And maybe that makes them more afraid of conflict or emotion in the future. So significant others or loved ones or family members have their own history that's going to make them sensitive to these tricky moments that people with BPD are experiencing. So they might develop their own beliefs about BPD or about their relationship with somebody with BPD that may or may not be helpful or accurate. So they might start to believe, oh, this person can't handle emotion or me being upset, so I can't say anything to upset them because I'm so scared of what happened last time when we had conflict. And while those kinds of beliefs are understandable, if somebody never shares how they're feeling, then, it's going to make connecting really difficult in a relationship, and probably actually potentially even feed this, threat sensitivity over time. So some people have these beliefs that they've developed on their own that might actually be kind of pinging and interacting with this interpersonal threat sensitivity. Not always, sort of depends on the person. But when people have those kinds of beliefs, they're going to be reactive in their own way. They might be more likely to react to signs that their loved one with BPD is upset with them, or signs that, that things aren't going right, or that they have upset somebody with BPD. And that is going to make it harder for them to communicate as well. So they have their own emotional reactions. They also are going to have problems communicating when they're feeling really emotional. And when both people with BPD and their significant other are having difficulty communicating, that's where we end up with conflict. That's also where we end up with things like pursuer, distancer patterns. Nobody is doing this on purpose. Everybody is often trying to connect with each other, trying to help, trying to be kind, and just reacting naturally to a situation. We just find ourselves here in these kinds of interactions. We kind of are always accidentally influencing each other in ways we couldn't predict. And sometimes what we see is that significant others have the best intentions. They want to help the person with BPD. And often significant others are so helpful to people with BPD. So it's not all bad. But they can accidentally reinforce destructive behavior too. So for people whose destructive behavior has a more interpersonal function, like communicating or influencing other people, that might pull the significant other to react in certain ways to it, which actually might keep the destructive behavior going over time. So this is just like an extreme example, but if somebody with BPD feels very, very uncared for, and significant others kind of aren't always expressing care, they have a lot of conflict in their relationship, but then somebody with BPD, like, I don't know, binge eats, and the significant other is really worried about them and expresses care in that specific moment in response to the binge eating, it might teach the person with BPD, not intentionally, but like that is how my needs get met. And so they might over time learn to do that again and again. This does not happen for all couples or all kind of pairs of people with BPD and significant others, but it can happen for some. And to figure out if it's going on in your relationship probably requires the assistance of a clinician who can help parse these things, because sometimes significant others being there in moments of crisis is really important and really helpful and can be really critical in providing a sense of safety for people with BPD. So it can really depend, but these pathways might be there. When people with BPD and their significant others have a lot of conflict and have these challenging interactions, it feeds back into this history that we started with at the beginning of the diagram here. So what we see here is like, there's no one to blame for this. Like I said, we just find ourselves here. Like we all transact with each other in ways that can kind of escalate and de-escalate various problems. But this is what we think might be happening in some relationships that contributes accidentally to keeping BPD going. I'm just going to take a little bit of time. I'm just going to take a little bit of time to just go over a little bit of evidence here, just to show what we have empirical support for and what we don't. There's research that on the BPD side of this model, there's research that people with BPD do have, more experiences of trauma in early life, more invalidating relationships, more abuse and neglect. And we know that people with BPD have fewer relationships in adulthood, but they're more intense. So they do have this history of conflict in their relationships. In terms of the interpersonal threat sensitivity, like I said, there's research that suggests that BPD is linked to this higher bias towards negative or threatening information, especially when that information is interpersonal, like an angry face. And people with BPD are particularly likely to perceive anger or negativity in faces, even when those facial expressions are actually neutral to other people. People with BPD also tend to experience people a little less trustworthy and be more sensitive and expecting of rejection from people around them. And that makes sense, right? If you have a history of harmful relationships or relationships where you've been hurt by people, you're going to start to expect that from other people, even people who are safe or kind or loving. I already mentioned this, but we have evidence to suggest that people with BPD have heightened emotional reactions, specifically in response to relationship stress like rejection, and that people with BPD's communication tends to break down, especially when their emotions go up. So there's something about emotions that really corrodes the way that people with BPD can communicate with their loved ones, which is difficult because they're also more likely to have those emotions in the middle of conflict. So people with BPD are really likely to have a hard time expressing themselves well and effectively when they are distressed, which is probably a good reason why, if somebody is, if any of you out there have BPD, and you're in the midst of a conflict with a loved one, taking a break and getting your emotions down before you return to that conflict might actually really help in facilitating that communication. I already talked about the fact that there's evidence that, especially behaviors like self-injury can regulate emotions. And there's also evidence that they can serve this function or role of meeting interpersonal needs, and that BPD predicts the likelihood of endorsing both of those functions. So some people do things like self-injury because it helps them get negative emotions down. Other people do it because it helps them meet an interpersonal or relationship need in some way. Some people do it for both reasons. It varies, but both things can happen in BPD. So one of the pieces, the take homes I want to say about this is what I'm learning from the research that I've been doing in my lab and the research that's out there is that I think people with BPD are kind of people. And what I mean by that is there's actually research that people with BPD have more relationships than other people. They just have a hard time maintaining them, and they often feel unsupported in them, but they're not less tender or loving or caring than other people. And in fact, they tend to find being alone or in isolation more challenging and distressing than other people. So I think that there's something about a lot of folks with BPD where they really get a lot out of connecting with people, and they really want very much to connect with other people. But there's some things that they struggle with emotionally and interpersonally that just makes that connection a little bit hard. It's hard to connect on like a deep level when you feel so threatened by other people and you're worried about being threatened and your emotions are changing really quickly. We can treat these things, but I think that's what's going on in these relationships. So I just talked about kind of, here's the evidence for all the people with BPD side of the things, the equation here of the model. You might ask yourself, well, what is the evidence for significant others? All that piece that I outlined as well. And it's a really good question. And the answer is we don't know very much about significant others. We need to learn so much more. So we know that significant others have their own struggles, that they experience higher levels of distress and grief and depression than other folks who aren't in relationships with people with BPD. I'm not suggesting that BPD is necessarily causing that, but just to say that significant others have their own struggles. They might be more likely to avoid in conflict or shut down. Remember that pursuer distancer dynamic. And the most important thing that I wanted to note is that they're often aware of what's going on with people with BPD, and they often want support for themselves and commonly have difficulties accessing it. And what that tells me as a clinician researcher is that it's not just that people with BPD need help, their loved ones need help too. And ideally we can help them together, which is something that we're working on in my lab. But that's basically all we know. And we are trying to learn a lot more. I'll talk about this at the end, but we're doing some research in my lab right now to learn more about the experiences of significant others, and also the experiences with people with BPD interacting with their significant others to try and flesh out this information a lot more. But what we know so far is we need to help people with BPD and their loved ones communicate better, because strengthening those relationships seems to really help BPD recover, or might help BPD recover. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about improving communication, but I see a question in the chat, so I'm just going to answer it really quick. Can one outgrow BPD? My daughter, who is on lamotrigine, seems to have outgrown it. Yeah, actually, there's longitudinal research, as in research that follows people with BPD over many, many years, that shows that BPD actually for a lot of people does level off and decrease over time. It doesn't for other people. There's something, that's okay if it doesn't, it's still treatable, but it does tend to decrease over time. And also, one of the reasons a lot of people don't like to diagnose BPD when people are teens is because a lot of people look like they have BPD in their teen years, and then it does kind of decrease over time for a lot of folks, and then other folks it doesn't, and then they kind of end up getting a BPD diagnosis in adulthood. So yes. Okay. So how do we improve communication? Okay, so this is kind of like the meat of the talk. If we know people with BPD and their loved ones need to learn how to communicate more effectively, how do we do that? Well, that's a complex question, and there's a lot of different answers. And what I wanted to offer in this talk is kind of like a tapas, like a little bit of a sampling of some of the things that we know are really helpful and important for effective communication. One is something called soft startups. So soft startups involves how we enter conversations. So if you enter a conversation, you're mad at your loved one, and you enter a conversation and you're like, why didn't you do the dishes like you said you were going to do the dishes? Just entering a conversation that harsh really increases the likelihood that you're going to have a communication breakdown and conflict and less functioning in your relationship later. So the more that we can enter gently into difficult conversations, maybe with curiosity, like, hey, I noticed the dishes weren't washed. Can we talk about what happened there? The better the likelihood that it's going to go well, because people tend to ping off each other really quick and get more and more distressed and conflictual and defensive and angry over time when a startup is hard. We also know that one thing that's really important to relationships functioning well is repair attempts. So when people have had conflict, and conflict is inevitable, all relationships have conflict, trying to actually repair the conflict later, come back together and say, like, I said something I didn't mean, I'm really sorry about that, I care about you. Even if it seems to have blown over, seems to be important for relationship functioning. So not chronically avoiding difficult conversations, but actually taking time to connect and repair together when you've had a difficult period or difficult moment. And for some people, that doesn't necessarily just involve talking about it and repairing it, apologizing, etc. That's important. It might involve spending some time together, having moments of intimacy where you're together, especially for couples, where you're together and sharing kind of moments of connection where people can kind of, almost it kind of soothes people who feel otherwise sore or raw from that conflict. De-escalation of negativity is really important. And one of the things that we do in my lab, we've been developing and testing interventions for couples when one person has BPD that are focused on treating BPD, treating partners' mental health, and improving relationship functioning all in one go at the same time. One of the things we teach people is how to de-escalate conflict when it happens so that they don't say things that just hurt each other more in the heat of a moment. So taking a time out when emotions are really high, getting that emotion down, and then coming back, doing the repair attempt, not chronically avoiding, seems to be really important for relationship functioning. But although we want to de-escalate negativity, we don't want to let kind of super high conflict run rampant in our relationships. What we also know is that emotions, including negative emotions, are really the glue that holds relationships together. So relationships where people don't express how they're feeling, including sharing negative emotions, talk to people about pain that they're in, don't have as much intimacy and closeness and connection. So a big part of having effective communication involves sharing how we feel and tolerating how we feel and tolerating how our loved ones feel, even when it's painful. That's a big part of promoting intimacy. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like in a moment. Validation is another way of responding to emotion that seems to be particularly important for people with BPD. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment too. So just a couple more things I'm going to say on this slide. Some other things that seem to protect relationships from difficult moments or give them a little more resilience and buffer is positivity. The more time for play, humor, affection in relationships, it's more than just nice. It seems to actually create a bit of a bolster that helps people bounce back from their conflict and their negativity more. One intervention we often do in couple therapy early on is called catching each other doing something nice, where we ask people with BPD and their partners to practice every single day, noticing and sharing something nice that their partner did for them in the last 24 hours. And we do that because we want to increase positivity in the relationship. Positivity begets more positivity, and it helps people build up this resilience to hard moments in a relationship that's inevitable. The last piece I want to highlight here around effective communication is I wrote as acceptance of individual differences. So we do a lot in family work, in couple work, to help people figure out how to communicate more effectively, change in ways that make sense for their relationship. But there's also ways that people are just different. Some people tend to process their emotions by talking a lot. Some people tend to process those things alone. Some people are really extroverted and want to be around people all the time. Some people are more introverted and they need more time on their own. And the more people in relationships can acknowledge and accept those differences, those just sort of inherent differences, without always trying to kind of critique or change their loved one, the more healthy those relationships tend to be. And a lot of what we often have to work on in our relationships is figuring out, well, what needs to change and what is something that I can just accept. I'm just going to say a couple. I'm going to talk about paraphrasing. Thanks for asking that. I'm going to talk about paraphrasing in one quick second. So I want to talk about a couple communication techniques that we have found in our couple therapy studies to be very helpful for people with BPD and their loved ones. And the first is called channel checking. So when we think about what we're doing when we communicate, there's really two main reasons we communicate with everyone in our lives. The first is to share how we feel, just to share something. I'm upset. I had a really hard day at work. This is what happened to me. And the other is to solve things. I need advice. I need you to help me. I need you to fix it. Often when couples or just anybody is having a breakdown in a relationship or difficulties communicating, we find that it's because the two people are on different channels. One person wants and needs to share, and the other person kind of moves in and tries to solve it or fix it. Probably all of you can remember a time in your relationship where you shared how you were feeling and somebody starts giving you solutions or advice, and it actually feels kind of bad. It actually kind of irks you or makes you irritated or defensive. It's because often when people jump to solving, when someone else needs just to be heard and understood, it's actually kind of invalidating. It kind of escalates distress, and that we find that this happens a lot in people with BPD's relationships. Often their loved ones, their partners, don't want people with BPD to be distressed. They want to help them. They want to fix their distress. They want to make them feel better. So they start offering advice and solutions as quickly as they can. But it's actually invalidating, because one of the main things we need before solving is almost always sharing. So sometimes solving happens first in an emergency, but even then we should typically go back to sharing after that. Sharing usually takes precedence for people over solving. So one really quick way that I often encourage people to tweak their communication is to do what's called a channel check. If you're talking to somebody about what you're feeling, tell them what channel you're on. Tell them, I really just need to be heard right now, or I want advice or solutions. And if you're the listener, ask, what do you need from me right now? Do you just need me to listen and hear you, or are you looking for advice? That can really help promote this intimacy and build up some healthier communication. So one of the other pieces I wanted to say is that emotions and how we experience emotions are really messengers for us. So when we experience an emotion in our body, it's trying to give us some kind of information. And when we express that emotion to somebody, it's kind of acting like a messenger. So when I say to somebody, I feel hurt that you were late for dinner tonight, and they ignore me, or they say, well, you don't need to be hurt because, or you shouldn't be hurt because it's not that big of a deal. So they kind of minimize how I'm feeling. My emotion is essentially going to go, okay, that message wasn't delivered. They didn't hear me. So I'm going to have to ramp up the volume. I'm going to go from a 1 to a 5 out of 10 in intensity. And then I might say, no, listen to me. I'm really hurt that you didn't do this. And then if they still say, hey, it's not a big deal, and just rebuff me, my emotion's going to say, oh, they didn't hear me. I need to try even louder. And then I might be yelling and saying, what's wrong with you? Why weren't you up? Getting really, really angry. And so one of the ways emotions tend to escalate, and this seems to be particularly true for folks with BPD, is when they feel unheard or invalidated, their emotions go, oh, I need to dial it up to deliver my message. Often, when people are on the solving channel, they're trying to address the distress, but the way it's experienced is as if the emotion is not being heard. So some really key pieces we can do to slow down our communication and make it more effective and build more intimacy in our relationship is to paraphrase and to validate. So there was a question about what paraphrasing is. Paraphrasing is just feeding back what you heard the other person say before you respond with your own thoughts. You don't have to, it doesn't mean you agree with what they're saying, but it's just showing them, I understand what you said. So often in our communication, we're not listening to each other. We're just thinking about what we're going to say next. And just showing somebody, I heard what you said, can help that emotion feel like, okay, my message was delivered. Whew, now it can come down and I can run its course. And then we can kind of talk. So in the kind of dinner example I just shared, a partner could say, what I'm hearing from you is that you're feeling really hurt that I didn't make it for dinner. Did I get that right? And then if the person confirms, yep, you got it right, they can say, okay, I didn't think it was going to be this hurtful for you because of X, Y, and Z. And they can express what they were trying to express the first time, but first they kind of showed that they get it. And that can go such a long way in communication. I don't know why we don't teach this in schools. And this isn't just to do for people with BPD. People with BPD can do this for their loved ones as well. It just facilitates communication all the way around. I'm just going to do this one slide and then I'll just save some time for questions. The last thing I wanted to say around communication is that one theory involving people with BPD is that because of the histories that a lot of them grew up with and the way that people responded to their emotions when they were younger and how dismissive they may have been, they're kind of allergic to what we call invalidation. And invalidation is just something that trivializes people's emotions, punishes them sharing emotions, or kind of dismisses them. There's a few different ways that it can show up. So one form of invalidation, like I said, is punishing emotional expression. So that could be something like, well, it's dumb that you feel that way. Okay, that's like obviously kind of a critical statement, but a more subtle version is, it's not that bad. You don't need to be sad. It's not that big of a deal. Sometimes these comments are just people on the solving channel. They're trying to be helpful, but they're kind of invalidating. And a lot of people with BPD really react strongly to that, and it can be quite hurtful. Another form of invalidation is oversimplifying how easy it is to solve problems. When you don't have BPD, you don't have the kind of emotional sensitivity that somebody with BPD has. So it's not always obvious why things are hard for them. Sometimes people with BPD's family or loved ones will say things to them like, I don't get why this is so hard for you. Like everyone else can kind of get up, get ready for work and leave the house on time. I don't understand why you just can't do that. Or something like that. That's so invalidating for people with BPD who are maybe, contending with all the same things that everyone else is contending with in the morning, plus like 10 out of 10 emotions and like this like emotional burn victim sensitivity. So often when they hear that, that makes people feel like, wow, I am a problem. There's something wrong with me. But what's really going on is that people around them who aren't living with the same emotional sensitivities as them don't appreciate how hard things can be sometimes. So it's just invalidating. The other form of invalidation that I mentioned earlier is when people are not caring or expressing a lot of concern unless something really bad has happened, like a crisis or a suicide attempt or something harmful has occurred. Kind of invalidates people, and it teaches like, yeah, that's the way to get care. And that actually helps people with BPD just kind of get like worse over time. It can really get in the way of recovery. So we really want in our relationships to make sure we're not invalidating, to stop invalidating and to start validating, which is the opposite, like conveying that emotions make sense. So when people share how they're feeling, feedback what they're feeling, or sharing, here's what I think makes sense about what you're feeling. Like this is something that's really understandable. Like I could imagine if I were in your position, I might feel this way too, or that sounds really, really painful. Makes sense that you're in pain. That sounds like it's really, really hard. Just taking some time to express something that makes sense about that emotion can be really helpful. Expressing empathy about what makes solving problems or difficult situations hard can be really important and validating for folks, especially when they struggle with an emotional sensitivity that other people may not struggle with. And one thing we want to make sure that people aren't just showing care or concern in crises, they're showing care and concern other times. They're showing care and concern when people express emotion that's not intense. Not when emotion's necessarily 10 out of 10, but when people just say, wow, I had a hard day, I'm feeling kind of sad right now. That's a great time to show a lot of care and empathy and concern, because that's a time when intimacy can really get built there. And it's really healthy and important for people to be sharing emotion at lower levels. If people suppress emotion because they're like, oh, it's going to get rejected, I'm not going to share how I'm feeling, all that does is kind of hold the lid down on emotion until it's at like a 10 out of 10, leading to like a big explosion or breakdown, and people kind of oscillating between a 0 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 and back again. So often we want to encourage people to be able to share, validate, and experience emotions at low levels as they occur through the day to reduce the kind of big fluctuations in their life. So I'm going to stop there and just I'll just summarize by just saying, no problems exist in a vacuum. No problems that any of us have exist in a vacuum. None of us exist in a vacuum. We are all bound up with each other in a complex network. I affect you, you affect me, we affect each other. That's what I think is happening for people with BPD too. People with BPD affect their significant others a lot. Significant others affect people with BPD a lot. And people can heal together and people can really hurt together too. So if you know any couples who are interested in this kind of work, there's a few things I want to draw your attention to. The first, this bias study is a study where we're testing for couples all over North America. We're trying to learn more about these relationships and learn the way that people with BPD and their partners communicate with each other about difficult things. So that's not a treatment study, but we're just following people to figure out how they talk to each other and learn more about that. So we can figure out, what's working in communication, what's not, what do partners need to do that's helpful versus not helpful. And people are paid for doing that study, and couples who are interested in doing that can email bpdstudy@yorku.ca to learn more. The SAGE study is the couple therapy study where we're testing the couple therapy for couples who have BPD, and it's only open to people who are in Ontario. But people who might be interested in seeing if they're eligible for that could email tuliplab@yorku.ca. And my website, which is tuliplab.ca, has all this research on it too, in case anybody is interested in those pieces. But the take home is really that BPD wedges itself between people in their relationship. BPD lives in relationships, not just in somebody with BPD, it lives in their relationships. And relationships can be where it hurts, but it can also be what can help. They can be beautiful, healing things. And I really want to figure out how we can use that to help all kinds of people with BPD, their loved ones, heal and grow together. And significant others need our help too. So we are paying a lot of attention to that in our lab to try and build these interventions, not just for people with BPD, but also for them. Okay, so thank you so much for listening to me. I'm just going to do some questions for the remainder of our time together. The question in the Q&A there, are you only looking to work with romantic couples or friends/family relationships as well? The study right now is couples only, just because it helps us in these early stages to keep the type of relationship as similar as possible. But the hope is that once we figure out if it's working, we can broaden into those other types of relationships. So the study's just couples, but I have my eyes set on other types of relationships too. Any other questions? Okay, going. Okay, done. All right.